He stood in the very last row of the chapel, dressed in a dark gray suit that didn't quite fit, hands clenched tight, shoulders straightened as if dignity could shield him from erasure. No one spoke to him. No one asked his name. He was just a stranger in the room. But the man in the casket up front, the one surrounded by flowers, tributes, and polished words had once whispered to him every night before sleep, "You are my home." Well, Nathaniel Brooks had never imagined that love could be so invisible. For 8 years, he had shared a life with Cassian Ward, a literature professor who could quote Auden by heart, but never found the courage to say one sentence aloud to his family, "I love a man." Their apartment in Chicago had once been filled with quiet music, secondhand books, and the scent of Cassian Wood incense. Their weekends were soft, predictable pancakes on Sunday, walks by the lake, and the comfort of someone to return to. But when Cassian's health began to decline, the quiet life they built began to unravel. It started with fatigue, then scans, then words like aggressive and incurable. Through it all, Nathaniel stayed. Every hospital visit, every night on the clinic floor, every whispered prayer Cassian never said aloud but pressed into Nathaniel's hands. When Cassian passed, there were no legal titles, no domestic partnerships filed, no boxes checked next to next of kin. And so when the call came from Missouri, where Cassian's family lived, it wasn't to invite Nathaniel to the funeral. It was to inform him that the arrangements had been made and no further contact was needed. He went anyway. He took a train, then a bus, then a long walk down a gravel road to the church he'd never been to before. He carried a pressed black tie, a letter Cassian wrote but never sent, and a memory of hands held across hospital linens. He arrived early, found the backmost pew, and sat silently. The ceremony began without him. Cassian's brother stood first, speaking of achievements, academic accolades, and family pride. His mother followed, mentioning childhood memories and how Cassian was a solitary soul. No one spoke of music, no one spoke of kindness, and certainly, no one mentioned the man whose entire life had revolved around keeping Cassian's last years from collapsing under grief. Nathaniel sat there, bone still, his face unreadable, but his heart full of pages that no one in that room had ever cared to read. When the ceremony ended, guests walked past the casket, whispering condolences, tears glistening under church light. Nathaniel stood last. He approached slowly, the aisle stretching like a lifetime. At the casket, he didn't cry. He simply laid the unsent letter gently across Cassian's chest, then whispered, barely audibly, "I remember." A woman at the end of the row eyed him suspiciously, as if unsure whether to call security or pretend he didn't exist. He turned, stepped outside into the cold Missouri air, and thought, that's it. That's all I'm allowed. But fate wasn't finished. As Nathaniel reached the end of the parking lot, a tall man in a dark wool coat stepped forward from the shadows. He had a leather briefcase in one hand, and a voice so calm it made Nathaniel stop mid-step. "You're Nathaniel Brooks, correct?" the man asked. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I'm Victor Gale, Cassian's legal counsel. There's a reason I'm here today. Mr. Ward left something behind, something only you're meant to hear." And just like that, the man who wasn't allowed to grieve was given a key to something no one else in that church even knew existed, to hear what Cassian left behind. Don't miss next part of this true to the heart story. Subscribe now to HeartStories, where real love never stays buried. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he could. His mouth opened, but no words came out. It had been less than an hour since he'd stood beside Cassian's casket, alone in a room full of people who pretended he'd never existed. Now this stranger, a man with polished shoes and the stillness of someone who deals with grief on paper, was telling him Cassian had left something behind. Victor Gale handed Nathaniel a white envelope with a silver seal. Inside was a key, a short note written in careful handwriting, and the address of a law office. The key was labeled Suite 307. The note only said, "Don't let them define what we were. I chose you. always. That night, Nathaniel checked into a small roadside motel with cigarette-scarred curtains and a buzzing fridge that never fully shut. He didn't sleep. He lay on the mattress, fingers curled around the key as if it might vanish if he let go. The next morning, he walked into the law office with the quiet energy of someone who had nothing left to lose. Victor was already there, sitting behind a wide oak desk. He stood when Nathaniel entered and motioned toward the chair across from him. No small talk, no condolences, just a nod of respect that felt more sincere than anything Nathaniel had heard in the past few days. Without a word, Victor opened a small safe behind his desk and retrieved a laptop. He placed it between them, opened a folder labeled Cassian Ward, Personal, and clicked on a single video file named To Nathaniel, MP4. The screen flickered, and there he was, Cassian, sitting upright in the worn armchair from their apartment in Chicago. He looked thinner, paler, the illness visible in the hollows beneath his eyes, but his voice was steady. The first few seconds were silent. Then he spoke. "If you're watching this, Nat, it means I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted to. It means I let fear win. I'm sorry." Nathaniel felt the air leave his lungs. Cassian continued. "You asked me once if I was ashamed of you. I didn't answer. I should have. The truth is, I was never ashamed of you. I was ashamed of myself, ashamed of how long it took me to live the way you did. Honest, brave, free." The man in the video paused to breathe. Then he smiled. "You gave me a home, Nat. Not just a place to sleep, a home. You made my life matter. I didn't have the courage to stand next to you in front of my family, but I had the courage to love you every day, and I want the world to know that." Cassian turned toward the camera slightly, as if gathering strength. "That's why I changed the will. They won't understand it, and they'll be angry. But everything I had, I leave to you. The house, the retirement fund, the royalties, all of it, not because you need it, but because it's the only way I can say you mattered more than anyone else ever did." The screen faded to black, and the video ended without fanfare. Nathaniel sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the screen long after it went dark. The room was silent, but inside his chest, 100 feelings collided: grief, relief, anger, vindication, and something else that had been missing for days, a small but certain sense of peace. Victor cleared his throat gently and handed over a folder filled with documents. "It's all been prepared. The assets are yours." Cassian ensured there would be no contest. Nathaniel took the folder with trembling hands. He didn't know what he would do next. He didn't know how to explain any of this to the world, or if he even needed to. But he knew one thing for certain: Cassian had not forgotten him, had not erased him, had not allowed their love to be dismissed as an afterthought. As he stepped out into the cold Missouri air, the sky was heavy with snow that hadn't started falling yet. He looked up, then closed his eyes. The grief hadn't left, but now it had room to exist beside the love. And sometimes that was enough. Nathaniel left Missouri without saying another word to the Ward family. He didn't owe them anything. Not explanations, not forgiveness, not even presence. What he carried home with him was heavier than grief. It was acknowledgement. It was proof. It was the first time the world, on paper and in law, reflected the truth of what he and Cassian had shared. Back in Chicago, he stood in front of the building he and Cassian had once lived in. The windows on the third floor still had the faded curtains Nathaniel had bought during a clearance sale years ago now. The front door creaked the same way it used to. For a moment, it felt like stepping back into a life that had paused, waiting for him to return. The apartment was just as they had left it. The stack of unread novels beside the sofa. The half-finished painting Cassian had started one rainy afternoon. The extra pillow on the right side of the bed, Nathaniel's side. He sat on the edge of the mattress and exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. But silence, even when it comes with peace, can be cruel. He lasted 2 nights. On the third, the quiet turned unbearable. The apartment had once been filled with present small sounds, music, the cadence of Cassian's thoughts spoken aloud while reading, Now it felt like an echo chamber for memories. So Nathaniel packed a suitcase with only what mattered: Cassian's last journal, a photo of them taken during a trip to Door County, and the letter he'd left on the casket. Everything else could stay. He wasn't running away. He was looking for somewhere that grief could breathe. Cassian had left him not only their apartment and financial assets, but also a property in Missouri, something Nathaniel hadn't known existed. A house on the edge of a quiet town called Monroeville, listed in the will as the place where I wrote best and where I want to be remembered. Nathaniel drove there with no expectations. The house was modest, faded blue shutters, a porch swing barely holding its chains, ivy creeping over one side like time trying to erase it. Inside, it smelled like dust and cedar, the air still but not unfriendly. The living room held a worn desk, a bookcase filled with first editions, and a coffee mug with the words, "Read more, worry less," etched on the side in Cassian's handwriting. Nathaniel walked through each room slowly, letting the space speak to him. This had been Cassian's writing retreat, his escape from academic duties and family obligations. Here, he had created without fear. Here, he had imagined stories where people like them didn't have to hide. In the study, tucked behind a row of poetry books, Nathaniel found a folder labeled Project After. It held scribbled outlines, character sketches, and a dedication page that read, "For the one who stayed even when I couldn't say it out loud." That night, Nathaniel lit a fire in the small stone hearth and sat cross-legged on the floor. He didn't cry. He just listened to the crackling flames and the ache in his bones. The weight of being remembered not as a footnote, but as the whole story. The next morning, Nathaniel made a decision. He wouldn't sell the house. He wouldn't leave it empty or lock it away as some museum of grief. He would turn it into something Cassian never had growing up, something many still didn't have now, a space where love didn't have to whisper. He opened a new notebook and wrote 3 words on the first page: the Emerson house. A place not for the dead, but for the living, those left behind, those erased, those still trying to believe that their love was enough. There would be books, there would be music, there would be people sitting in chairs just to listen, and maybe, just maybe, there would be healing. What began as silence was becoming a voice. The idea was simple, but grief makes even the smallest plans feel like mountains. Nathaniel stood in the hallway of the old house in Monroeville, pen in one hand, hesitation in the other. The floors creaked with memory. The walls seemed to breathe, and yet nothing moved without him. He began with what he knew: silence hurts, so he filled the rooms with sound. He brought in books, some from their apartment, others donated by neighbors who didn't ask questions when he said, "It's for a space where people can sit and feel safe." There was no grand opening, just a handwritten sign on the porch that read, "The Emerson House, all are welcome." At first, no one came, but Monroeville, like most towns, carried quiet stories. People watched, they whispered, and eventually someone knocked. A teenager with a half-shaved head and shaking hands asked if they could just sit for a while. Nathaniel led them to the window seat in the reading room and left them alone. They returned the next day with a friend. Soon, there were afternoons when all the chairs were taken. Volunteers helped Nathaniel repaint the porch. Someone donated string lights. Someone else brought an espresso machine that sputtered but worked well enough. The house began to breathe again, not with sorrow, but with something closer to warmth. Nathaniel never gave speeches. He wasn't a teacher. He didn't tell people what the Emerson house was meant to be. He just listened. When an elderly man came by asking if he could play the old upright piano in the living room, Nathaniel nodded. The notes were shaky but full of something honest. When a woman sat in the backyard for 3 hours and cried without saying a word, Nathaniel brought her tea and left her alone. The rooms of the house didn't judge. They absorbed. On one quiet Thursday, a man in his 70s appeared. He carried a tattered briefcase and a photograph, yellowed at the corners. He said nothing at first, just walked through the front hallway like someone revisiting a past they had tried to forget. He finally turned to Nathaniel and said, "My brother used to talk about this house. Said it saved him. I never believed him, but now I do." Nathaniel never asked for names. Some stories were not his to own, but some were dangerous. Cassian's presence lingered not like a ghost, but like a page left half-written. Nathaniel found notes tucked inside old books, margins filled with scribbles, lists of quotes, fragments of what could have become novels. One slip of paper simply read, "I hope someday love won't require explanation." Every time Nathaniel found one, he placed it inside a glass case near the fireplace, not as a shrine, but as a reminder love, when real, leaves traces. Months passed. The Emerson house grew. News outlets began to notice. A grieving partner turns inheritance into safe haven for the forgotten. One headline read, "Nathaniel didn't care for recognition, but he allowed the attention because it brought more people through the door." One visitor stood out. She arrived one autumn morning, crisp leaves still clinging to her coat. She introduced herself as Camille, Cassian's former student. "He changed how I saw the world," she said. "I used to think love had to hide. Then I read one of his essays, and everything shifted." She had tears in her eyes when she saw the study where he used to write. Nathaniel didn't speak much that day. He simply opened the window and let the wind carry Camille's silence through the house. That night, he sat alone by the fireplace, Cassian's last journal in his lap. There were pages filled with poetry, half-formed thoughts, and sketches of a graveyard with no names. But on the final page, Cassian had written something in bold, looping ink. "If I go first, and he still chooses to remember me, tell him this: look under the willow tree." Nathaniel stared at the words. He knew the property had a tree like that old, leaning, its roots curling toward the earth like fingers trying to hold on. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the darkness. The night air was sharp, the wind restless. The willow tree stood at the far edge of the property, near the back fence. Nathaniel knelt by the base, brushing away fallen leaves, damp soil, and pieces of stone buried beneath time. His fingers hit something solid. He pulled gently. Dirt gave way to shape. It wasn't a box, it was a plaque, brushed clean. The engraving read, "Reserved for Cassian Ward and Nathaniel Brooks. In life silenced, in death remembered." There were no dates, no flowers, just words carved in stone, hidden where no one else would think to look. Nathaniel collapsed to his knees, the flashlight flickering in the grass. Cassian had not only left him the house, he had left him a place, a final resting ground, a space where they could be named, side by side, in a world that never once allowed them to be that in life. But Cassian had believed in something stronger than shame. He had believed in memory. The plaque beneath the willow tree changed something in Nathaniel, not just because it proved that Cassian had, long before his death, imagined a future where their love could rest side by side in truth, but because it showed that even in silence, Cassian had been trying in his own way to make space for them to exist. The Emerson house continued to grow, but Nathaniel no longer moved through it only as a keeper of grief. He began to walk with a steadier rhythm. Not healed grief doesn't vanish like that, but steadier, as if love had left behind a map, and he was finally learning how to read it. He had the plaque restored, cleaned, preserved, and eventually brought above ground. He placed it in the small memorial garden behind the house. A bench stood nearby, where visitors could sit beneath the low-hanging branches of the willow tree. There was no sign, no announcement, just a path worn slowly by footsteps. Some days, people would ask, were they a couple? And Nathaniel would simply say they were each other's only. There was something sacred about the ambiguity. Let people see what they needed. What mattered was that the names were carved in the same stone. What mattered was that they stayed. The Emerson house became more than a sanctuary. It became a story. A young singer recorded a song after playing Cassian's old piano. A grieving father began attending every Tuesday, bringing a book of poems he never shared aloud, but always left open on the same page. A local library partnered to offer writing workshops for queer teens. Some people came for peace. Others came to learn. and some simply came to sit beside silence and know they weren't alone. One afternoon, a man arrived in a suit far too expensive for Monroeville. Nathaniel recognized him immediately, Cassian's brother. They sat on the porch, 2 chairs, 2 mugs of coffee, and a silence long overdue. The man looked older than Nathaniel remembered. Weary, not bitter, just lost. "I didn't come to argue, Papa," he said quietly. "I came to understand." Nathaniel didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. The brother walked the halls. He touched the edges of Cassian's desk. He stared too long at the framed letter beside the fireplace, the one Cassian had written for Nathaniel. Now hung not as proof, but as a promise. When he returned to the porch, he said only one thing: "You built something he'd be proud of." Nathaniel didn't smile. He just nodded. It was enough. The seasons changed. Leaves fell. Snow came and melted. Time did what it always does, move forward without asking permission. But the Emerson house remained. Still small, still quiet, still full. And beneath the willow tree, the plaque stayed, weathered gently by wind and memory. Nathaniel never remarried. He didn't need to. He lived surrounded by voices, by laughter in rooms that once only knew echo. Sometimes he would sit beneath the tree and read aloud the passages Cassian never published. Sometimes he said nothing at all, but always, he stayed. One morning, a visitor from out of state stopped by him. He asked Nathaniel what the house was. It's Kaylee, museum, library, therapy center. Nathaniel thought for a moment, then said, "It's a home for what the world tried to forget." The man didn't ask anything more, and maybe that's all it needed to be. Because for those who were once erased, having your name remembered even in stone, even beneath a willow tree, can be the loudest kind of love. Have you ever seen a love story that the world refused to acknowledge until it was too late? Tell us in the comments. Your voice might be the healing someone else needs to hear. Subscribe to HeartStories to keep witnessing the stories that were once hidden, now told out loud, because love deserves to be remembered.